Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to what we hope will be a very interesting session today. As we start, I just want to acknowledge that we are all here sitting on indigenous land, more specifically the unceded land of the Musqueam people. And so, in light of the topic we're looking at in terms of migrants, we should all remind ourselves that we are all migrants here, invited or uninvited guests on the land of the Musqueam people. My name is Handel Wright. I'm a professor in the Department of Educational Studies. I'm also director of the Center for Culture, Identity, and Education. And so to all of you, I say welcome, salam. The session today is organized around the theme Iranian/Canadians, Homeland, Diaspora, and Belonging. And I want to say that this session came about mostly because of the visit of Alireza Sadeghi, who's assistant professor at Alameh Tabatabai University. Wow, I've said it a few times now, I can actually say it. So he's spending 1 year as a visiting scholar at the Center for Culture, Identity, and Education, and in the department. And he's doing research on Canadian multiculturalism and multicultural education, and how that can inform multiculturalism and multicultural education in Iran. There are copies of the outline of the entire panel, so you can look at folks' bios. I don't want to introduce every single member, but most of these people I know very well. They all have a connection to this place. Miriam Nabavi will be discussant for the session. Miriam used to be my student, and she's done some excellent work on Iranian identity, Iranian Canadian identity. Beside Miriam is Taha. Taha, how do you say your full name? Just Vosta is enough?
Yes.
Okay, Taha Vosta. And Taha is doing his PhD currently with me also. So there's a theme going on here. Nilofer Shidme used to work with me for a while, but the urge to do creative work was too strong, and she was pulled in the direction of that work, and she's done some excellent work. I still think she has a beautiful essay on Charles Taylor's notion that she ought to publish. I don't know if she's published it. The one person I did not know before is Shadi, who is from the University of Alberta. And Lynette Schultz saw the ad for this talk, and she said, "It's so wonderful that Shadi is going to be there." So no pressure, Shadi. You're representing the University of Alberta and the entire province of Alberta.
Thank you.
And finally, Nilofer. Nassim. I keep mixing the two of you up.
Yes.
Okay. So Nassim, I really want to thank especially because apart from the suggestion to do this, when we came up with the idea of doing this panel, Nassim has worked so closely with me, so hard on this, that basically she's co-creator of this panel. So I want to thank her especially for all her hard work on this. And she provided this amazing image, which I thought was so powerful, which she took in Iran, of this boat. If you look at this, of the boat and the figure standing on the boat, and I think of this as, are you anchored to the land? Are you anchored in a new land? The boat can take you somewhere else. So what does identity really mean? I'm really interested in that topic. So I'm somebody who's interested in identity, and all of these folks are interested in identity. And we want to look at homeland and what it means to be in diaspora. And each of these people are experts in their own ways on that topic. So without much more ado, I want to thank Yao Zhao, who's my GRA, who's worked with me on some of the arrangements for this. I want to thank the department head, Ali is here, and Alex especially, who's done a lot of the design for this work. So with that as something of an introduction, we're going to have a presentation. Because Ali Riza is our esteemed guest, he gets a little bit more time. So he gets 20 minutes, and everybody else gets 15 minutes. And Nassim is going to be chair for the entire session, and so I'm going to hand over to her. So thank you everybody for being here. Welcome. Salam.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here and be hosting this session. Thank you so much, Handel, for the introduction. So, as Handel mentioned, the 5 presenters will be presenting in the order of the names in the poster, and Dr. Alireza Sadeghi will be the first presenter, and his topic will be multicultural education in Iran, requirement, challenges, and solutions.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I would like to thank, special thanks to Handel and other guys. همچنین از دوستانی که لطف کردن و با دعوت من اومدن خیلی متشکرم. My family, my daughter. Okay. My title is Multicultural Education in Iran, Requirements, Challenges, and Solutions. My subject are what is Iran, what is multiculturalism, multicultural levels, is Iran in multicultural society, requirements, challenges, and solutions for multicultural education in Iran. Where is Iran? Do you know Iran where it is? Iran in Africa, yes? Yes. No, Iran is Europe, in Europe. No, Iran is here. Please see.
Push them.
Come back to Iran. I'm delighted to introduce Iran. First, a general information about Iran. Iran is Southwest Asia, Middle East. Iran is Middle East. Iran is an ancient country about 7,000 years old. Iran has mountains, seas, desert, and jungles. There are 4 seasons at same times. 4 seasons. Oil, gas, iron, copper, gold, silver, and etc. Khayyam, Sadi, Ibn Haytham, Ibn Sina, Kharazmi, Rumi, and Rayhan, Zohrawardi, etc. These are poets and scientists and mathematics, and it is important. It is important. Iran has more than 20 religions and more than 25 sects. Please see this clip.
I am the spring wind. I have traveled all over Iran for years and have been more and more bewildered each day by its charms and attractions. Gnostic poet, Attar of Neshabur. The more you traverse this territory, the deeper your bewilderment. Open its hands in prayer. Praising the unique and compassionate God has been practiced in Iran for thousands of years. Zoroastrians, Jews, Christians, and Muslims have lived alongside each other in peace and harmony for centuries.
Okay, come back to my main discussion. What is multiculturalism? Different people have different definition for multiculturalism. As you know, Banks, Bainar, Paraphrase, and the right have different definition for multiculturalism. More repeated phrase in this definition are equality, anti-discrimination, social justice, peace, solidarization, culture, race, ethnic, and ethnicity. My definition is multiculturalism is the presence of several different ethnic and culture in the context of unified geographic boundaries in order to achieve social justice and a peaceful life. Multicultural levels. As you know, we see different levels about multiculturalism, but the difference, diversity, and multiculturalism in multicultural society is the more than representative. Difference, diversity, multicultural society. I want to say Iran is a differences or diversity or multicultural society. I believe Iran is multicultural society. Please see Iran's map. Iran has 13 group and ethnic and 20 religions. For example, for ethnic, Azeri, Mazandarani, Gilaki, Turkmen, Sistani, and Rorish, and I believe Iran is multicultural society. Don't diversity, don't difference. Isn't diversity, isn't. Okay. Come back. For example, show. Based on previous evidence, Iran is a multicultural society, therefore, it needs a multicultural education system. Requirements for multicultural system. National requirements and transnational requirements. For national requirements, I think different cultural evidence, as you see, Constitution of Iran and Iran special features. In Iran constitution emphasizes to multiculturalism, but it is limited. It is limited. And features of Iran. Iran has a feature, a special feature. Yes, Iran has special features because boundaries of Iran is Sunni. Near boundaries of Iran is Sunni. Central government is Shia. And yes. And Persian Gulf exists transnational actors. And neighbors of Iran are experiencing problem. Iraq, you know Iraq, and Afghanistan, even Turkey. I believe Iran has special features. And transnational requirements, I see it. Okay, challenges of multicultural education. I think main challenges in Iran multicultural phobia. انقسام فارسی میگم. ما در ایران از مالتیکالچرالیسم فوبیا داریم، ترس داریم، مثل فمینیسم که ترس داریم. به همین خاطر فارسی گفتم عمدن. Condition of Iran, Constitution of Iran. Constitution of Iran is limited reference to multiculturalism. Knowledge challenge. I think we don't have more knowledge about multiculturalism in Iran. And policymakers, curriculum designers, teachers' resistance, school environment, teaching and evaluation in curriculum has a problem about multiculturalism. And solution for multiculturalism in Iran, I think we should amend the constitution of Iran, and we should development multicultural literacy. I think we established multicultural NGO and a strong inter-ethnic relationship, mother tongue education and instruction in school, teacher education and university aim, content and teachers. And then finally, in Iran, our motto is diversity in unity and unity in diversity. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yes. That's okay, I can sit in that one. Thank you so much. Thank you, Saturday. So I think I will hand in to Shadi, our next presenter. If I can. Another. Sure. So Shadi's presentation title will be I Want to Make Canada My Home, Iranian Students in the Tornado of Diaspora. Sure.
Thank you everyone for coming to our session. Just before starting, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a PhD student in my fourth year at University of Alberta. And my work is focused on Middle Eastern students' identities, which part of Middle Easterns for sure are Iranian students. So I decided to focus this work a little bit an Iranian part of my study, and then bring in a little bit of my own experience as well. So my work is, let's continue. Just before, it's good to have a little bit of statistics here, I guess. According to Iranian government, there are 55,686 Iranian students studying abroad, which 5,600 of them are studying in Canada, which are 1.4% of total students in Canada. At UBC, the Iranian students are ranked 4. At University of Alberta, they ranked 3rd. So there are quite huge number of Iranian students at UBC and U of A, which is my own university. And when they come here, Iranian students, or let's say Middle Eastern students, have special background. They are coming from a conflict zone, from war zone, some of them. So they are usually coming to Canada to have a better life here. And when they come here, they have to deal with social and political pressure resulted from bad relationship between their country and here in Canada, especially in Harper's time, you know about it, political sanctions and all of those things, which resulted to pressure on students, let's say, lives. And also they have to deal with questions of identity, which is very important. They are being questioned all the time. Do you eat by hand? Do you ride camel? These sometimes offensive questions are challenging their identities all the time, which make them kind of resentful in some situation about being here in Canada and wanting to make here as their home. So in this study, as you see, the issue of identity is very important. So I decided to have this question, which is how has my participants as an Iranian student experienced being an international student here? Which this leads to more auxiliary questions which support that research question, which are how has my participant as an Iranian student experienced being an international student in Canada? How does their experience of a war and conflict in their home country affect their life experiences here? Sometimes we think that, okay, we had a background and we left it there and we came here and we are having a good life. No, it's not that. Identity is a process. It comes with you. Your experiences are coming with you. So whatever you bring with yourself is affecting who you are now and how you live now. The other one is how is being from Iran affecting their experiences of being an international student coming from that zone, coming from Middle East. So I use post-colonial perspective here, mainly focusing on Orientalism, Edward Said's Orientalism, which divides the world, which says, he believes in that the world is being divided into the binary of the West and the East, or the West or the rest, which he believes that this has created so many problems for some individuals who are kind of under the power of some others. So Said argues that the West has created, as I said, the binary of the West and the rest, and that there are Westerners, on one side there are Westerners, and on the other side are the Orientals, which are the Easterns. And the former are rational, peaceful, liberal, logical, capable of holding real values, while the others don't have these characteristics. As you know, this view is quite common in so many Western countries, and has permeated every structure and relations in such societies. So this is my perspective to analyze the data that I had. So for this research, I used qualitative research and constructivist from the constructivist paradigm, which is my work is actually kind of interpretive case study. I interviewed 4 Iranian students, and I wanted to talk about all of these 4 students here today. But one of the ladies asked me not to present her here, even though I assured her that you'll be, everything, your name, you will be anonymous, and all the confidentiality will be there. But she, I don't know, for some reason she didn't want her to be presented here. So today I will report on 3 of my participants. I had in-depth interviews, open-ended questions, along with some pre-interview questions which helped our conversation to get warm and much more in-depth. Okay, so let's go to the narratives of the participants. The first one was a lady, Rojan, who is a confidential, strong 20-year-old. I'm gonna tell you the narratives because it is very important for you to get to know them first and to know from what background they're coming. So Rojan is a confident, strong 20-year-old woman who was born and raised in Sanandaj, the Kurdish capital of Iran. She moved to Tehran when she got accepted to an engineering program in Tehran University, and rented with her classmates. She rented an apartment in central Tehran and lived there for 2 years of her study, and then moved to the apartment of her mom's aunt, who was living alone. She described herself as an outsider in the big Tehran, especially in her first years of her study. After her graduation, she decided to continue her study abroad, and she ended up at the University of Alberta, Edmonton. She's found the transition from Sanandaj to Tehran much more difficult than from Tehran to Edmonton. Rojan believes that her look has helped her a lot to get accepted by the Canadian society, where she is being perceived as Caucasian with her blue eyes and light skin, which is very important, I guess, characteristic here for her to get accepted. Yet she has found herself in challenging situations in the Canadian society when it comes to her Iranian identity, she believes. Rojan graduated from university and is working, while waiting for a permanent residency, is working in an engineering company. The other participant was Ali. Ali is an outgoing 30-year-old PhD student with a critical attitude about different subject matters, born and raised in Iran. While studying in chemistry department, he is very much involved in political activities related to Iran. He used to be an activist in 2009, Iran's presidential campaign supporting reformists, and was being investigated by the Iranian government for months for his political involvements. So he had a reason to come here for sure. He traveled to Iran once in a year and sees this as a good survival strategy, being far from his roots and his family as their only child. Ali finished his bachelor in Amir Kabir University, which all Iranian knows is a political university, let's say, but political technology university, and moved to Edmonton for his master's. And then he started his PhD. And during his stay in Canada, He has received the Canadian society very accepting, despite some discriminative attitude and policies against Iranians. He believes that his extended reading on different political issues in the last few years has broadened his perspective about the world's incidents and relations, and see this as a player for him to get integrated to different culture. Saeed is the other participant, is an energetic, smart 31-year-old guy who did his master's in computing science at SFU and has been working for a well-known American IT corporation in Vancouver from 2012. He was born in Ahvaz and moved to Aswan when he was 11 because of his father's job. While loving Aswan and his people, he and his two older sisters see Ahvaz as their hometown. Saeed believes feeling bounded to a place is very important in feeling integrated and belonged. During years of his stay in Vancouver, he has been trying to make himself feel like home by sticking to Iranian community and practicing Iranian culture and tradition. He believes Canadian culture is against any prejudice and promotes diversity. However, in practice, he has found it discriminative when it comes about Middle Easterns. So let's move on to narrative threads that I found between these three participants. Okay. So discussion around the concept of identity
You still
four?
have time. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Discussion around the concept of identity of my Iranian participants found its way to their experiences of war and conflict, as I said. They believe that Iran-Iraq war and the internal political conflicts in Iran have played an important role in shaping who they are. For example, Saeed says, I call myself the child of war. I have witnessed so many horrible things back in my life in war and conflicts, and this has made me strong and for sure different from someone who is raised in a peaceful farm. Ali said, this is the image that the Canadian state shows to its people like Iranian deserve to be sanctioned, and he is referring to the political economic sanctions that is exerting pressure in their lives even here. They have found such policies very discriminative, which make Iranian to feel resentful about Canada, as for example, Rojan says, I love Canada, but each time that I have to send my documents to the States to get renewed because they closed the embassies both in Iran and in Canada, or whenever my parents have to travel to another country to get Canadian visa to visit me, I feel like being disrespected and being discriminated. Another thread that I found was that the participants discussed that what they are as Iranian is much different from what they are being recognized with as being Iranian. Saeed says, for me, Iran is associated with great history, rich culture, art, and poetry. Look at us. I'm sure no one knows the concept of love better than Iranians. They just need to read our poems. Yet they are being accused of so many bad things, and they're associated with things. So they found that they are being involved in dialogical process with their personal and collective self as Iranians and the self that is imposed by the Canadian society. Another important thread that I found was that the participants discussed the idea of home and how feeling like home helped them feel belong. They found themselves struggling to find a way that attached them to Canada and feel like an insider, which is very important. I feel as insider with my own people in my own community. As Tuan says, Tuan explains home as a place which we grow up in, where their sense of self developed along with their sense of place, the integrity of the one meshing with the integrity of the other in the sublist of mutual influences. All of the parties see themselves constantly wandering between the ideas of getting back to the Iran and making Canada as their home. They believe that this is much more difficult decisions for Iranians, since the social and political and economic pressure in Iran have made their lives in trouble, and negative discourse against them in the Canadian society have made them feeling as outsider and as others. They all discuss that in order to feel safe and integrated, they want to make Canada as their home. So although the participants of my study were happy living in Canada due to the Orientalist construction of their identities, the questionings of their identities and the othering of their identities, as Mian says, they have experiencing challenges. They told me the stories of prejudice and discrimination, and yet denied it when I asked them directly about it. I cannot criticize. For example, Rojan told me, I cannot criticize the Canadian society and the Canadians are racist or whatever when I'm living in their country. See how they see themselves. Still, they see themselves as outsider and say that their country. While the Orientalist identity and being considered as other is a manifestation of discrimination, my participants found it more comfortable ignoring the instances rather than dealing with it, which they believe make their lives more difficult. So now what? These are the stories, or can be the stories of all of us, you know, this experiencing difficulties, challenges, discrimination, racism, or whatever that we are experiencing. And we need, I guess, what we need to do as educators is that we need to create counter narratives, the narratives that help these students to be represented as who they really are. We can focus on policies, we can focus on research, on education, or we can start from individuals, then go to communities, and then it will permit the society the good practices that help these students feel more integrated and feel as insider. Thank you.
Thank you, Shadi. So I guess it's my turn now. Again, hi everyone, and thanks for joining us. I changed a little bit of my title that I posted on the poster, but I kept the strike through because I wanted to make a point. So my title is now Hijab and Visibility, Encountering the Image of Hijab in Contemporary Iranian Artwork. And this presentation is actually based on a paper I wrote for my MED in Art Education in the Faculty of Curriculum and Pedagogy. But in that paper, I was more focused and curious about the reasons behind the popularity of a particular theme, the theme of hijab, in the works of several contemporary Iranian female artists. And so I looked at the context of art education and art production, specifically after the revolution, 1979 revolution. But since graduate and since submitting that paper, I've always been thinking about it and always felt that there's something missing from that analysis. So now in this presentation, I'm more focused on seeing the connections between these artworks and these themes that are used and politics of representation of non-West, in the West, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and the current situation that we're seeing, like the travel bans and all these problems. So I want to start with a very short story, kind of experience that I had in one of graduate courses. The course was about visual research, and we had a discussion about online civic engagement. And at that time, I think Taha and I were in a group, so we were presenting an online campaign, a Facebook online campaign called My Stealthy Freedom, which started by a female journalist a few years ago, Masih Halinejad, and she's more dedicated to reflecting the concerns of Iranian women who are protesting compulsory veiling and the issues they might have faced with that in that regard. So, after presenting or after talking briefly about that campaign, one of the classmates, a Canadian female classmate, raised concerns and questions about. So hijab is a freedom of choice, and everyone can choose to do that. And what's the reason of having that campaign? And at that moment, me and some of the classmates had to highlight the point that this campaign is not about protesting or opposing against hijab. It's about opposing its compulsoriness and its being forced in Iran. So that kind of incident, it was an eye-opening experience for me to think more about these topics, the complexity of these topics. And I know so many of us have seen these sad incidents happening throughout the past few years. And this is a specific incident in the French beach of Nice that the police actually forced a Muslim woman to kind of unveil and uncover because of security concerns. So this is again another side of the coin to see how this concept, how hijab has been perceived differently in different parts of the world. And it is important to see all of the complexities within it and the nuances. So the first series of artworks that I wanted to show today is by Shadi Qadirian, not this Shadi, another Shadi, and it is called Like Every Day. And in this series, Qadirian created 17 digital portraits of women, female-like figures, covered with a fabric that we call it chador. It's a kind of veiling, and in these specific pictures, it is a patterned fabric that it is usually used in casual situations. The more formal kind of these veiling is a black fabric. So in all of these portraits, like the ones that I have here, the face of these women are covered with household and kitchen utensils, such as a colander, a saucepan, naran, and so on. And I wanted to just mention that she was born a few years before the revolution, and but these works, all of them, has been exhibited outside of Iran. So in this specific situation, this was an exhibition in Saatchi Gallery in United Kingdom, and the title of it was a group exhibition. The title was Unveiled: New Art from the Middle East. And in an excerpt in the Saatchi Gallery website about this specific series, they say, challenging the international preconceptions of women's roles within an Islamic state, Tehran-based artist Shadi Qadirian's photographs draw from her own experiences as a modern woman living within the ancient codes of Sharia law. Her images describe a positive and holistic female identity, humorously taking issue with the traditional roles by which women, both in Middle East and universally, have been defined. Humorously drawing upon the humanistic forms of each item, common goods resonate with suggestive narratives, ironically exaggerating misogynist typecasts. Another series of artworks, two pieces from Shirin Nishad's series called The Women of Allah, which was created in 1997. Nishad was born in 1957, so many years before the revolution, and a few years before the revolution, he left Iran to study art in New York. And a few years after the revolution, he pays a visit to Iran. And this series is actually a response to that visit and the kind of, she uses the word of shock, the kind of shock that she experienced after seeing how the face of the city and people have changed. So as I mentioned, she herself indicates that much of her works has been defined by Islamic revolution and her responses. These are her responses. In an interview about the Women of Allah, this series, Neshad articulates that in Islam, women's body has been historically a type of battling ground for various kinds of rhetoric and political ideology. Regarding using written Persian poems on these female bodies, in her works, she says she tries to portray a symbolic voice of women whose sexuality and individualism have been obliterated by the chador, the veiling. But there is a problem here, and in all of these narratives, and also the excerpt that I read from the Saatchi Gallery website. So, in an interview, Neshad was asked if she'd ever been frustrated that people from outside Middle East would confuse Persian script with Arabic calligraphy or text excerpted from Quran. She responds, unfortunately, there is in the West that rush to generalizing when representing me as someone who makes work about Muslim women. I don't do that. I'm very specifically talking about Iran. So this problem of generalization has been, I think, very nicely illustrated in this quote from her. And so every work that represents veil or the symbols alike are supposedly speaking about whole Muslim community around the world, according to many of the taking from these kind of exhibitions. Therefore, the nuances gets fade. So I chose a framework for analyzing and looking at these pictures as artworks specifically. I chose Susan Sontag's framework that she illustrates in her essay Against Interpretation. And this essay is I really encourage, if you haven't read that, to read that, a 1996 essay. In that, in her framework, she allows or she favors going beyond the content of artwork. And her framework also allows for analyzing the historical and political context of the creation of these artworks. And she rejects reductive approaches that reduce all artworks to the same story. And she gives credit to the sensuous immediacy of the work of art rather than their meanings. She also favors descriptive interpretations or descriptive criticisms rather than prescriptive ones. And she says seeing art as its content exerts a kind of hegemony. Sontag says, and I quote, "To interpret is to impoverish, to deplete the word in order to set up a shadow word of meanings. It is to turn the word into this word. The function of criticism should be show how it is what it is." I use Sontag's framework here because this can be expanded to examine the context of art production beyond the its visible contents and identify potential pitfalls of pre-interpretation resulting managing and taming of art. So it's also useful to take a brief look at, and I will skip some of these, look at the art market, both international art market, world art market, and art market in Iran since 1979. So after the revolution, art production has been kind of very much influenced by all of the revolutionary beliefs, and art has been a medium for publicity in the Islamic Republic. So the propagandistic feature of it has been very highlighted. And they believe that this feature kind of hindered the attention of the world to this specific these artworks. And but in the past about 2 decades, there was an expansion of the art market for contemporary art from Iran and generally from artists from Middle East. And this was kind of followed by a kind of curiosity about others. And the curators and dealers respond to this curiosity. So this reconnection with the world art market, although allowed the artists to kind of enjoy a kind of more stable patronage and exposure and more resources, in a space like with less censorship, but at the same time, the reconnection entailed dynamics and some issues, as well as issues. So Eshki argues that a great deal of the artwork presented by Iranian contemporary artists of the Iranian diaspora gained success only because of the representation of Iranian nationality through the use of easily identifiable signals of the Iranian ethnic, cultural, and historical identity. Torshizi also argues, sorry that I'm reading very fast, the transportation of artworks from Tehran to mostly Western European and North American cultural centers entail interdiscursive translations that will render them legible for their reception in a new context. Bound up in these translations are performative acts of language that label these artworks as markers of ethnic alterity, unexplored localities, and most of the time associates them with issues of gender and femininity, and therefore limited to the vocabulary of veil, plight of women, and sexual inequality. He then points to the legacy of Orientalism and indicates that the marginalization of artists of the non-West remains as vexing and as forceful as it has always been. Torshizi also argues that in the realm of contemporary art, artists of the non-West are removed from the contemporariness of the contemporary art, and their artworks are constantly demoted as representations of the fixed image of their locality. So let's skip this quote by Lopez and pose this question. So what does these artworks mean? Do they mean, as Spivak says, are they strategic essentialism by Iranian contemporary artists, or a hidden force towards colonization of art production from that specific region? And what does all these conversations mean now in this era and in the context of post 9/11 and now in the context of Trump era, with the travel bans banning citizens of mostly Muslim countries, including Iran? So how reductionist approaches can be dangerous in this context? Do I still have time? Just one slide.
Take a minute.
Sure. Okay.
You deserve it.
So I just kind of going to end my presentation with posing some questions, because as I mentioned, it's just a plan for revising. So I'll definitely appreciate your comments as well. My questions will be, can these artworks be viewed as simply self-expressions by women from the experience of living in an Islamic state, or negotiations of their identity in the intersection of state rules, faith, and cultural traditions? In what ways the curatorial strategies or the trends in the art market might have impact on the practices of cultural reproduction and or representation? Are we facing with a predefined frame that, regardless of the artist's thoughts, has defined our understanding about Middle Eastern women? To what extent such artworks can work towards reducing xenophobia or be considered as multicultural art that values diversity? To what extent are they separated and categorized as simply ethnic art or cultural productions that feed into more stereotypification and or generalization? Thank you. Okay, so our next presentation is Nilufar, and I'm trying to pull up her presentation. So Nilufar, do you want to switch this? So her title is Iranian Poetic Voices in Multicultural Canada. Thank you.
So thank you everyone for being here. My name is Nilofar Shidmer. I'm an instructor in the liberal arts program at Simon Fraser University, and I have a BA, an MFA, and a PhD in education, all from the University of British Columbia. So I'm going to talk about two Iranian Canadian poets. These two poets, one of who is myself, are the only ones who write in English, and also they have published their works in English. So the first poet, her name is Banuzan, but this is only a pen name, and it means Mrs. Woman in Farsi. So she has published 2 books of poetry so far. Her last book came out just 2 months ago. It's called Letters to My Father by Piquant Press in 2017. And her first book, which I looked at, is called Songs of Exile by Guernica Editions and came out in 2016, a year before, a year ago. And she's an arts activist too. So she's the founder of a poetry reading series. It's called Shab-e-Sher, and in Farsi, Shab-e-Sher means poetry night. And she runs this poetry series in the city she lives, which is Toronto. And this is the most diverse poetry reading and open mic series in Toronto. So to get a taste of her poetry, I'm going to play a 2 minutes poetry reading by her. So the sound, sorry. Just on the screen. Okay. How to max that? Yeah. Go back. Oh, sure. Okay. Oh, it's not there? Oh, sorry. Here?
Yes, we can. Let's come out of the presenter view. I think it's because if you're in the presenter view. What is this? I can never do this. Okay. So I'll minimize this.
There you go.
Our music is playing.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's okay.
And if there's any time at the end, I might come. But before I do this poem that I'm going to do, I would just like to tell you that I have started a poetry reading series, and we welcome people with different poetic voices, ethnicities, cultural, religious, political affiliations, or whatever, you know. So we love diversity, we love to represent everyone. And please do not let our event be dominated just by a few voices. Invade it with your voice. So this is what we want. Okay, so for the moment I'm going to do a poem. The title is Judgment. Love is no ceasefire. It bombs the cannibal flesh. An enemy in disguise, bearing blood-stained teeth at the news that it never existed in the surrender citadel of euphoria. Stop it now, before it's too soon to begin. I'm kissing the last battle, ready to plunge my sickle into its heart, rip and chew it raw. I'm dancing in its fire, profaning the sacred madness that yields to the advances of philosophy. Love has committed treason, and I am to execute justice. I will keep it shivering at every shelling. I will fight it to the end, even if it means we both live forever. Thank you.
Okay. So another poet who has written and published in poetry in English and also short fiction is myself, Nilüfer Şidmer. So I publish both in Farsi and my mother tongue and in English. This is my first book in English. It's called Shirin and Saltman. Came out in 2008 and it was nominated for a BC Book Prize. And this is my second book, Between Lives, which came out in 2014. And yeah, it hasn't been nominated for any prize. And then I have to publish two poetry books. One is called Two Nilüfers Before and After Migration, and another one is called In the Garden of Exile. And when I was yet in Iran, I translated with some other translator together. We translated Toni Morrison's book, The Bluest Eye, into Farsi, from English into Farsi. And that's a copy of that book. And so that's my literary background. And so now,
Can you put it on the presenter view? Sorry. View. No.
okay. Okay, now I'm going to talk about our immigration history and life in Canada. Banu Zan arrived in Canada in 2010, so she's relatively newcomer compared to myself because I came here in 97. So I've been in Canada for the last 19 years. And she came from Iran also, and she taught in Iran at the Department of English Literature at the University of Mazandaran in the city of Babolsar. And she calls herself a traveling poet, and she says in an interview, "Leaving Iran, the land I have always loved more than any god or human, was not easy. What made it even harder was that Iran is a poetic land. But I was brave enough to be a coward, leave my years there behind and plunge into the universe." So in a poem called Journey, she says, "On the way to nowhere, the question crossed my path. Will you be happy? I looked back. What a luxury I could not afford. I had left my treasures to poverty, my story to those who prevail. I had left myself behind." So she thinks that she has left herself behind. So her kind of exile is the exile from herself. Okay? and is a kind of a spiritual self, as I'm going to talk about. So for myself, as I said, I arrived here in 1997. I changed my life path completely because in Iran, I have a degree in mechanical engineering. I was an engineer, graduated from Khaja Nasir University of Technology, and I practiced as an engineer, and I worked for the city of Tehran. So by coming here, I also plunged into the unknown. And I changed my life path. It's been a long journey. So I basically started from the scratch, studying, getting a bachelor, a master of fine arts, and a PhD. But I was a writer and a translator also when I lived in Iran, and I went to many poetry and fiction gatherings, and I never stopped writing in my mother tongue. So I have actually kept a connection, a link to Iran through writing in that language and also publishing. So I'm a regular contributor to many websites. I also publish essays. For example, I published essays on the BBC Persian, Akhbar Ruz, Radio Zamane, and also some feminist websites, because I'm a member of the, but if you can call it a membership, a part of the Iranian women movement. So we are trying to advance women's rights in Iran and across the world. So how I feel about, Iran and what's my relationship, I read out a poem to you so that speaks for my feeling. It's called Because My Family and I. Because my family and I live on 2 continents, the distance turned my mother's cancer into just news, the same as it did to the death of my father and my uncle and my grandmother. My body remains unaffected until I see my mother without hair, with one breast left, or my dead father's ashen face. But the day will never come when I go back home next time. My mother's hair is grown, her breast full with prostheses, and my dad is a glowing, framed man. So we two Iranian Canadian poets have very different poetic styles. Banu's poetry is more abstract and is metaphorical. So she has these meta poems. Her book is consisted of meta poems and is peopled by figures from Greek and Persian history and mythology, like Plato, or for example from Iranian mythology, Gorda Farid, or Tahmine from the Book of Kings by our national poet Ferdowsi. And her language is spare, her tone is serious, sometimes is somber and conceptual, and sometimes fiery and feisty. For example, she frequently uses the word rape, but in a kind of positive way, in a defiant tone. So, for example, she says, "Your agony is evidence that I have raped your ego." And she sees losing the ego as a positive thing. My style is more kind of, narrative and lyrical. Some of my poetry is autobiographical, and I use also irony to ease out the kind of grave situation I describe in my poems. So to finish this presentation, I'm going to read one of my poems. I see, because I see in being in exile also a an opportunity like Banuzan to for intercultural connections and for marriages of basically minds. And true enough, it's been hard to live in exile, but I found my beloved husband, who is from another country, from the Czech Republic, here. I met him here, and this poem is dedicated to him, but it also talks about how I feel in Canada. It's called Few and Far Between. In Iranian language, we have a expression, we say "Filesh yad Hindustan karde," which means that his elephant is longing for Hindustan, and you'll find out what it means in this. Few and far between. As in a Persian saying, their elephant is longing for Hindustan. My husband and I, a Czech and an Iranian, each has an elephant here in Vancouver. However, my dear elephant, from time to time, for no good reason, longs for in Iran instead. 1,000 years ago, at the time of Rumi, India was the farthest place to travel to. Only merchants could go that far. It might have taken them 7 years. On their return, they brought souvenirs, silks, perfumes, colorful parrots, and elephants who did not feel at home in Persia with its legendary rose gardens, warm climate, good food, and the kindness showered on them from the merchants' children. Only those in exile, few and far in between, who also longed for their Hindustan, plus poets, whom elephants confided to, could understand how these foreigners really felt. This brings me to my husband, who for the last 7 years has been spending every other Friday night with his friend Vit at the sauna, chatting in Czech, leaving me at home alone. These are the times my elephant really gets going, longing for her Hindustan, where she could prowl around speaking Farsi, and it becomes extremely difficult to stop her. But then, at the very last moment, she comes back thinking of the Czech elephant, of his late night arrival, of the same longing, if it's not for him, whose first language is not akin to hers, she would have left Canada a long time ago. After all, there is a third language. Our elephant's English, la langue de cour. And as Rumi says, hamdeli az hamzabani behtar ast. The language of hearts surpasses the language of tongues.
Thank you so much, Nilüfer, for making our panel colorful. So I'll invite Taha now, and can you remind the title of your presentation to me? Iranian Cultural Imaginations, Experiences in Modern Civic Life. Can you open it there? Can you lift it up? Yes.
I usually feel that I'm still in Iran. I haven't even entered Canada, but now I feel I'm totally in exile. Yeah.
Yours? Sure.
So yes, here we go. Sorry for being very dry and boring after this very emotional presentation, but yeah, that's all I can do. So my title has changed a little bit to Iranian Cultural Imaginations, Experiences in Modern Civic Life. So I will talk about it. I will talk about the change later. So there's a vast literature in the Western social sciences on the question of cultural identity, which mainly address issues and questions regarding cultural difference and encounters between cultural groups and individuals. The central questions of cultural identity in the Iranian intellectual and social scientific literature, however, is either the historical and political question of what is the best or true definition of Iranianness, or secondly, the sociological question of how Iranians look at their identity, which their identity means, again, the true definition of Iranians. My general project is to engage with both sort of questions. However, I do not see identity in the way it is usually conceived would be the proper theoretical tool for that. Instead, I use the term collective imagination, and in particular, cultural imagination. I should confess that it is not well theorized for me yet, but generally speaking, I use it to refer to perceptions of collective life at a more phenomenological and pre-representational, pre-discursive level, closer to the psychological experiences, which undoubtedly are in direct relationship with the discursive manifestations of identity. The main claim for using the term is that the relation of human person with one's collective subjectivity in many cases is neither a matter of boundaries and differences nor any well-defined set of characteristics, but it's rather a set of clear or vague images and imaginations which might or might not set boundaries, include characteristics and or moral judgments. It may, as an image, be even constructed and judged not by oneself but under the gaze of the other. It may, moreover, be not exactly an image of oneself but a bigger picture of various collectivities or any spectrum on which one is dynamically positioned. I justify the use of the term basically based on the fact that one's cultural subjectivity could be imagined in varieties of ways, which I want to compare under the general overarching term collective imagination, or in particular cultural imagination. I started this project with the term ethnocultural imagination, maybe because of my obsession with the ethnocentric Iranian nationalism. But the more I looked at what I call collective imaginations, in especially modern Iran, the more I believed that sticking to the ethno-racial is not satisfying. So I changed it to cultural imagination instead of ethno-racial imagination. And I use the adjective cultural with a total awareness of its connection to the social and to the political. So I start with the historical background. I kind of go back to find the origins of modern Iran in Safavi Empire, 1501 to 1736. There's in Safavi Empire, there's a semi-nation building project making Shia Islam the formal religion of the empire. The political cultural order at that time for Safavis were Turks and the Sunni Ottoman Empire. Safavis even were cooperating with European Christians politically and culturally against Ottomans, because the Ottomans were the common enemy between them. So even Shia rituals are transformed at that time and inspired by certain Christian forms of public rituals. After Safavis, we have Qajar dynasty between 1789 to 1925. I would say that the major event at that time is the Qajars and Russia wars. This is when Iranians encounter with European modernity and at governmental and intellectual level, but not very much in public culture. It's basically encountering with technological. So the new other at this time becomes kind of the European. So and Iranian intellectuals also start during Qajar times. Start to go to Europe and start to look at Persia, their own history and people from the superior others' point of view. Some of them import these ideas as well as an urge for cultural westernization as their main souvenir back home. And what I later called Pan-Persianism is an intellectual product of this time, which later the next dynasty in Iran, Pahlavis, makes the core ideology of the nation-building project of establishing modern Iran. So what I call pan-Persianism is a category of nationalistic discourses, which are usually articulations of various elements from Persian ethnocentrism to anti-Islamism, mainly in favor of modern lifestyles and pseudo-modern values. They're mostly based on ahistorical and anachronistic narratives of the pre-Islamic era in the Iranian history. They especially are fit together through a pseudo-modernist depiction of the ancient pre-Islamic Persia as a society with high respect for human rights and freedom of women, as opposed to the Islamic culture. Islam is racialized, associated with Arabs, and at the same time implicitly or sometimes even explicitly considered a lower culture. For example, Cyrus the Great, a king of ancient Persia, is considered as early founder of the idea of universal human rights, and Zoroastrianism is considered more tolerant and egalitarian in terms of gender issues compared to Islam, and so on. And Pahlavi dynasty, the first dynasty, which is kind of establishing modern Iran at that time, start a very top-down project of modernization. The state propagates this form of Iranian identity through two main modern apparatus. One, the national media, newspapers, TV, and radio, and very importantly, the educational system. Half of the population at that time were not actually Persian, as Mr. Sadeghi very comprehensively discussed. Although they were likely to seem Persian to the European eye and the intellectual who is looking back to his own people from the European eye, and based on what he learns on the other side of the border. So the two main enemies of such political cultural views are Islamists on the one side and socialists on the other side, which also have a more kind of internationalist point of view. So as the reaction to these kind of discourses, I want to look at I have a little bit of problem, it seems here, not showing everything. But the word missing the title is Teacher of the Revolution. Ali Shariati, he's called in Iran the Teacher of the Revolution. He's one of the most influential Iranian intellectuals in modern times. Internally and internationally, he's translated into more than 20 languages, quite well read in many Muslim countries. And he was very successful very influential also, intentionally or unintentionally, in mobilizing the educated and middle-class Iranians in support of Islamic revolution. But his understanding of revolution is firstly moral and cultural, and secondly political, based on his text. So he is part of, or one of the most important founders of the what we call in Iran the cultural movement of Islamic intelligentsia, return to oneself, or his very kind of important motto, Irfan, equality, freedom. Irfan means mysticism or kind of spiritual elevation in Farsi and Arabic. So he's kind of he gives an existentialist and socialist reading of Shia Islam. He emphasizes the word takes the word mustazafin out of Quran and makes it a very prominent concept in his ideology. Mustazafin means the people who are kept weak. It's a very broader. It's a term very broader than any sect and religion. It's kind of a revolutionary cultural imagination, the oppressed against the oppressors. It's very anti-imperialist. And looking for political and economic independence and cultural confidence. So what he did was kind of bridging between two major political oppositions at that time, socialism and Islamism. So it very much helped the Islamic 1979 Islamic Revolution happen in Iran. And what I will refer back to, I would say there is a, really? Okay. There's a kind of a moral collectivity as opposed to ethnic and national and religious identity. So I kind of skipped the Islamic revolution, which is basically anti-imperialist at political and cultural level. Even at that time, some secularist communists were kind of in favor of Islam, for example, the compulsory hijab. So it's kind of at the time that Islamic culture becomes the symbol of resistance to imperialist culture or bourgeoisie culture, or however it is framed. So I come to recent experiences, the experience of kind of what I remember. So my generation's political cultural socialization was shaped very much influenced by a modern versus traditional dichotomy, which each of them coming from the two governmentally sanctioned and propagated discourses of Iranian culture. But since the Islamic Revolution, the government tries to preserve and support the traditional side. But especially since the rise of the reformist movement in 1907, the modern is back into power in a public sphere, even if not in the as part of the political power. So the reformist movement since 1979, led by Islamic intelligentsia, moderate wing of the government, mostly liberal, relatively pro-Western. The cultural discourse is against Islamic dogmatism, and the cultural imagination is kind of a reconciliation in the middle of the spectrum of the traditionalism and modernism, and kind of trying to giving a globalization-friendly Islam. Afterwards, we have Ahmadinejad. Probably you know him better than the others. So what Ahmadinejad was doing was kind of, he was kind of enacting the two opposite sides, the Pan-Persian side and the extreme Shia side, and wanted to make a mixture of that. But the dichotomy, it's a sign of how the dichotomy is so strong that it doesn't work. So at this time, we don't have a very much of change in the cultural imagination, I would say. The Green Movement, the reaction to Ahmadinejad was kind of trying to going back to the Islamic revolution's idea, but with a moderate reformist way. So it was going to give another kind of reading of the middle of the spectrum, but from again a revolutionary moral point of view. But again, the dichotomization, I would say, was so strong that the representation of the movement was very much on the modernist, liberalist side. So after this, look at the political discourse in relation to the cultural imagination. I want to go back to how is it, how I can see the condition nowadays among the Iranian populace. As discussed, since the reform movement in the late 19th, sources of cultural power and political power were separated to a great extent. Modernism is hindered, but not marginalized culturally and symbolically speaking. Today, the tradition-modernism dichotomy is a vertical north-south polarization rather than a horizontal one. The superiority of the moderns is still very much shaping the social-cultural spaces. Traditional forms of life are basically under question in the public sphere while still holding the political power. And there's much effort among them to justify traditional values and lifestyles by pseudo-modernist discourses. As a result, I would say the cultural imagination among many Iranians nowadays is still very dichotomized, but you can see kind of how the modernist Iranianness is kind of becoming a question of who I am under the Western gaze. On the other side, the traditional Islamic Iranianness is usually is a dark image of a failed history. the last point I want to make, that in this two depictions, we can see that both sides of this imagination has kind of lost their dynamic nature and turned into static images. They have become images of who we are, or even in the more individualist versions, who I am, rather than any kind of what we can do together. So, and by this I suggest that they have lost their moral potential for any kind of political collectivity. Yes, that's all.
Thank you, everyone, for staying with us this long. And I'm sorry it took a little bit longer. Thank you to all the panelists. And now I would like to invite Dr. Mariam Nawawi, who kindly agreed to be the discussant for this session, to take the floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you for organizing and having me here. I very much enjoyed engaging with all the papers and learning more in depth during the presentations. What I'll do is a brief background and a synopsis of all the different presentations and kind of the key pieces that I pulled out of them, and I'll pose a number of questions to the panel that you might want to consider engaging with today or in your future work. So the presentations, diverse across topics, theory, and methodology, share in common the complexities of a diaspora identity and belonging across not just national identities or cultural formations, but also transformations and within real and imagined places and art forms. So we've seen this included in national discourses of multiculturalism, literary and visual art forms, popular culture, and the cultural everyday. Across these presentations, notions of self, home, the nation, and of being are central for exploring diasporic spaces and places of inclusion and exclusion. The presenters have theorized and interrogated difference not just across large identity categories such as class, ethnicity, religion, amongst others, but they've also shown us how those identities shape the trajectories of immigration and representation and belonging in the diaspora, and more importantly, how those identities of the other can be used as a vehicle for meaningful forms of social and political action across institutional and cultural landscapes of the diaspora, of the multicultural diaspora, through arts, activism, community building, which in turn builds a politics of recognition. Shadi, I'll start with yours.
Sure.
Your presentation provides a very rich point of entry for understanding the Iranian international students' everyday life in the diaspora. As you spoke about this less today, but more so in the notes that you shared with me, but using theories of place and everyday life, you've unpacked for us the role of place in experience of being an international student and the potential of place in building an international student construction of a diaspora identity. Your unpacking of the third space or homemaking, perhaps in the context of this presentation, I think is important to pause on. As a space where your participants situate themselves as being unable to fully perform their Iranian identity by virtue of having to perform a diaspora identity, and at the same time not owning the capital to have a Canadian identity, shows us that this third space, which creates a feeling of hybridity, is more than a combination of identities that are stacked on top of each other, but rather it's a set of really messy, intersecting, politicized identities, which one occupies by the national discourses, cultural performances, and the individual's own process of sense-making in the diasporic spaces. For me, I suggest that hybridity is not a choice, but rather a circumstance of identity in which a person can't choose which identity to adopt and which to reject. Hybridity has its roots in injustice and inclusion, and there are multiple influences in the lives of immigrants or international students that position them as hybrids. What we also know is that identity is ultimately not fixed or static, but rather multiple, changing, shifting, intersecting, and overlapping. So what this raises for me, Shadi, is what is a hybrid identity for international students whose identities become more complex, overlapping, and evolving over time? Niloufar and Nassim's engaging presentations draw on the notion of politicized identities to get at the heart of the politics of representation, using art as a social justice intervention for both challenging hegemonic conceptions of the migrant and the Muslim woman. We see that the diasporic spaces in which these sorts of interventions happen are equally hegemonic. Niloufar speaks of the poet's right to representing culture and moves beyond espoused stereotypes of how one is or should be and the potential that has to ward off isolation and marginalization. Nassim speaks of an artist's freedom for expression in diasporic spaces. In the examples provided, both your presentations provide a window into the ways in which those living in the diaspora have a choice in representing, negotiating, and forming identities. And those choices are ultimately political. For me, what both these presentations highlight is how art forms, representations, meaning-making of various forms within the diaspora experience are a negotiation of identity and belonging, which I think responds to one of the questions that you posed at the end of your presentation. And I think through this process of meaning-making, there's ultimately a necessary exile from oneself that needs to happen. Ali Reza's presentation provides an important contextualization of the national landscape, identities, discourses, and ideologies that form an Iranian diaspora identity. His analysis of the ways in which Iranian multicultural milieu is drowned out by the political and ideological context of Iran and effectively shapes the discourses around multicultural education is important, as it provides a foundation from which to trouble notions of the nation and nationalism. As we engage with the themes of this panel, homeland, diaspora, and belonging, Dr. Sadeghi, your analysis of the Iranian context shows us that similarly in Canada, notions of the multicultural milieu are, and by extension multicultural education, are rooted in nationalist values and what it means to perform citizenship. In both Iran and Canada, there's relevance in what Michael Apple calls the null curriculum, insofar as there's a failure to teach a relevant multiculturalism that is connected to individuals' lived experiences, the changing politicized landscapes of national and global belonging. Taha, your presentation explores the notion of Iranianness and the inward gaze of the Iranian identity by weaving together key moments in Iranian history. You use the idea of the cultural imagination to unpack the ways in which identities are produced, both by oneself or, as you highlight, under the gaze of the other. The project of unpacking the complexity of identity across time, culture, and politics, and geographies, while not easy by any means, is incredibly valuable for bringing to bear the ways in which identity is precariously situated in between various national and non-national identities and identifications. Across both those presentations, Ali Reza and Taha, in your work is embedded the idea that culture and identity are but two sides of the same coin. In this, we find comfort in Stuart Hall's idea that, quote, identification cannot be constructed in relation to a political system alone. It has to be constructed on cultural meaning. It has to be embedded, that is to say, in an imagined community. There were three questions that were raised for me across the different presentations. The first was in relationship to the relationship between identities and spaces of belonging. Across the papers, we learn of spaces of representation, where an Iranian diaspora identity is somehow able to exist. Occupying a diasporic space is perhaps even a desirable space, as one can be both an insider and outsider without reprise. As Nassim highlights, within the art space, and I quote, this space in which they feel freer to express their feelings about where they come from through art while not being fully to their receiving community. In other words, I wonder of the ways in which creating spaces of belonging and representation facilitates creating new identities, such as the chosen identities that one adopts in the diaspora, and similarly, the identities one has chosen to reject from their homeland. So I pose to the panel, what is an Iranian diaspora identity? Is it always going to be marred in complexity in light of the histories and representations associated with it, as Taha has outlined? And beyond that, what is the role of diaspora identities within the nation? If diaspora identities are to have a legitimate place as a citizen of a nation, do we need to articulate what it means to be a citizen? And importantly, is Canada a nation whose multiculturalism is a necessity of its identity, capable even of welcoming a diaspora identity that is messy and complex? My second observation from the presentation is in regards to doing this work as Iranians and having personal experiences with the very topics you discuss. And this is something that I very much grappled with in my own work. We cannot forget that as much as there is diversity across our theorization of diaspora identities in relation to Iranian bodies and imaginaries, it is not possible to theorize an Iranian diaspora identity in isolation of one's own identity politics. As presenters, you are all situated within a vantage point of being a member of the group, of being situated within the diaspora and sensitive to how complex politicized identities are represented and for some of us even lived. On the one hand, the insider position, or as James Banks aptly calls the indigenous insider position, demands, I think, a very careful scrutiny of the privilege of speaking for the experience that makes up homeland, diaspora, and belonging. The late Joe Kinchlow reflects that claims to truth are always discursively situated and implicated in relations of power, suggesting that our own power in articulating these stories cannot be minimized. This raises for me the question of how, as researchers engaging with topics that ultimately overlap your own lived experiences, you work within the biases and assumptions that you're bringing to your work. Is it a necessity of the work you do? Is it possible or even desirable to separate yourself from it? And finally, I think it's very important to ask what it means to do this work in the new times that we're in. Whether we focus on the vilification of the other, as we've seen in countless forms in Trump's New America or mosque in Quebec City, or whether we focus on the salience of borders, as we've seen in the form of walls between nations, bodies of deportees found off a bridge hours after being deported, as we saw last week, and those crossing farmers' fields into Canada, or whether we focus on grassroots movements in opposition to top-down policies and practices such as Black Lives Matter or the Women's March in Washington, that is consistent is the ways in which there is centrality in the margins. In other words, the topics and issues that have long been at the forefront of different forms of inclusion and exclusion are being taken up across different identities, politics, and positionalities. In Canada, discourses of critical multiculturalism are carving out a space for shifting the margins into the center. What does this mean for the work that you're doing? Is there a desire to move it from the margin, or is its efficacy in its position in relation to the center?
Thank you. Thank you, Mariam, for very insightful points and the questions that you posed. So any of the panelists want to provide answers to any of Mariam's questions, or maybe it's better to open up to questions from, because I think we're short of time. So any questions from the audience? Yes, please.
My name is Saeed, and I'm from Iran. I'm from a Turkish minority of Iran. And this panel is very interesting to me because, in Iran, non-Persian people are deprived of their right to have education in their own language. And as a growing up in Iran, as a 7 years old, I went to school. Everything was in Persian. There was no single book, it's in my language. And when I was in high school, as an activist, I collected signatures from my high school in Erbil and sent to Minister of Education in Tehran on the time Hazi, asking for education in my mother tongue. And for doing that, I was investigated by intelligence service, and I was questioned for many times, 4 times at least. And at the end, I have to write a paper that after this, I will not involve any discussions about language, culture, identity of non-Persians in Iran. And we know that Iran is not a homogenized country, there is a diverse. And within this context, 3 days ago, it was the International Mother Language Day. And ironically, in the same day in Iran, the court, Revolutionary Court in Pakistan, sentenced 4 activists, linguistic rights activists from Turkish community, to 10 and 15 years prisons and 2 years of exile, and for doing linguistic rights activism, civil activism. And Dr. Sabili talked about the lack of linguistic understanding, multicultural understanding in education is rooted in lack of understanding, which I will challenge that argument. The lack of multicultural education in Iran is rooted in Iran Foundation, as Taha argued, as a nation imagined itself 90 years ago through Pahlavi and through racist ideology of Persian and Aryan superiority, which otherized non-Persian group and aimed to assimilate them and define their culture as barbaric, not civilized. And it is rooted in that. And education is a tool to assimilate that non-Persian ethnic groups, and this is ongoing. And unfortunately, in mainstream Iranian cultures, when talking about non-Persians, also we see misrepresentation. Dr. Sadeghi referred to Turks as Azeri. We know this is a problematic in Iranian context. I'm from Erbil, and if you ask my grandmother, my grandfather, what is Azeri, they wouldn't know, believe me. They call themselves Turks. And we know that in Iranian, this word Azeri referred to them as denying their identity, telling them, you are Azeri, you are not Turk, and Mongols came to this country 1,000 years ago and changed your language. So this is the essentialist discourse. So I would, we always ask from anyone talking about us to refer us as the way we do in our daily life, and it's very important. If we multiculturalism is about social justice, we need to not lose the discourse which is rooted in the operation. And thank you very much.
I have a similar experience because I am an ethnic minority in Iran. I'm half Kurdish, half Arab. I grew up in Ahvaz, and the same thing. One day, some of my classmates were Arab ethnicity. They were speaking Arabic in the class, and they were actually sent to the principal's office, and they had to give the oath that they will never ever speak Arabic in school again. So that's very interesting. Now I'm hearing a similar thing from you, from Turkish background. It's very interesting. But really, I like to touch on the same thing, that the same hegemonic culture of Persian culture, Persian language. We hear it a lot. People who introduce themselves as Persians, coming from Persia, is kind of excluding the rest of us who are not Persians like we are. I think these are so to do research on the issue of Iranian identity. We need to really dig into what are the levels within the Iranian identity. It can't be, because I don't know how, it's a reduction to say that I'm doing this research on Iranian identity and this is my findings. Yeah, it's a reduction, and using Azeri language is a reduction of Turkish identity, because like you speak Azeri, it's your dialect, it's not your language, it's not your culture, it's very distinct, So that's very distinct. And I didn't want to ask the question, making comment here, but now that I'm hearing this, it's just triggered something in me. So I really wish that you are doing your research in the area of Iranian identity and ethno-diversity in Iran. I think this needs to be addressed, that we exist, because when I was 14, I moved from Ahvaz to Tehran. I was taunted and bullied because of my accent, because of my original culture, and because the rituals that I had were just different from the way people practice in Tehran, and people were not accepting of me. And when I used to tell them I'm Arab, and they would ask me, are you from Saudi Arabia? Are you from Iraq? They were in total denial that there are Arab people who are from Iran and live in Iran, and they didn't immigrate from anywhere, and I think this is something that needs to be addressed so that we feel included as Iranians. Just one more thing I want to say, Shadi. I felt that you were surprised when you were talking about what Rojan told you. I had the same experience as Rojan. So for me, moving to Tehran I had a huge cultural shock. Then when I moved to Canada, I felt people were more accepting of me in Canada than my own experience in Tehran.
Thank you so much for your comments. It's very important, and I think in my work, I faced with these issues because I talked to four Iranian people, students with completely different, coming from different cultures, from Azerbaijan to Sanandaj, Kurdish, background and everything, and they all had different experiences. And I think your comment about just labeling Iranian and defining the idea of Iranian identity is just a simplistic way of dealing with the culture, what it comes from Iran. It has layers, and I'm hoping that in my research I deal with these layers and try to focus on them. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much. This is quite interesting. I'm very pleased to see my friends here, and also I'm very happy with the guests. My first encounter with the Iranians, it was Jamais sans ma fille. The title in English is Never Without My Daughter. That book scared me so much. I'm coming from a place where at the time women are not allowed to wear hijab. Women, co-education, we are very modern, very westernized. I want to say modern because this is also a whisper to Taha, thinking of modernity and post-modernity and how so this is the context that I personally coming from what we call an Arab and Muslim country had about Iranians. So I think that diaspora and thinking of Iranians in the diaspora and thinking especially of art and the work, do you think that to a certain extent there was an agenda of a colonial imaginary that has impacted art of Iranians, and particularly focusing on women, and particularly on the issues of hijab, and it was an attempt to get all the issues of Iran restricted in this kind of minimalist image of Iran, that is the modern Iran from Western concept to the primitive and the Islamic Iran. And it was like the body of women was a very important point in that debate. That was a lot of focus on that, a lot of focus on issues of women, visibility and the body and the hijab and all that kind of stuff. So because they come from a different perspective, the veil was an act of resistance. It was not an act of oppression. So how do you see the political here interfering with even the religiosity? Another point is that hopefully that we can unpack this kind of word, Islamic culture. I don't think that we have an Islamic culture. We have billions we have a billion Muslim, and all of them come from different cultural contexts. What is perceived as oppression in Iran has been perceived as a liberation in another country. So here we have to locate the Iranian diasporas with all their engaging political issues, I think, apart from religiosity or religion, to unpack the political system and the connections with the Western imaginaries of what Iran is. Because you have a specific, framework within the Western imaginary. So how do you, as intellectuals, leave these kind of dynamics, being here, there, thinking of home, as a product of being here. So it's an imaginary home. So I'm very interested to know your personal experience with the dynamics, with your let's say struggles with political regime, the kind of Iranian Islamic format, particularly for Iran, and how you navigate being here and there.
You can answer, but I want to just pose a question to you that don't you think that the argument you just articulated is part of the Western imaginary arguments too? You are not out of that. You are articulating an argument from within Western imaginary.
In a sense, that's why I said diaspora is so heterogeneous. So the experiences are not common, and I'm sure that if we have an intersectional experience, the diaspora experiences, for example, for an Iranian man, is not similar to social class plays an important role. Gender plays an important role. Our sexual orientation, our connection to our religiosity plays an important. So my question is how, I live the same dynamics. That's why I feel like we are in multiple positions. That's why I think even the hybrid space we are talking about, now we are talking about translocational. In every location I call, flyers, anti-afro. We are moving with our positionality in different directions, and we are never in a hybrid space. I don't know, this is something that I'm personally and academically debating, so how do you deal with that? That is, what's the common space you're seeking here?
Yes, a little bit, okay. First, I think I should talk a little bit about the fact that the terms like traditional, modern, Islamic culture, all the terms I use in my work, they're all sociological terms as how people imagine these, not as what I am suggesting as who is doing this work. So, but it's very important that yes, people understand this as a dichotomy. So and we should not neglect that and go through the sophistication, theoretical sophistication that okay, the traditional modernity dichotomy doesn't exist because it exists in people's mind and they're experiencing it and understanding their experiences through that dichotomy. So the first was that I think talking about my positionality as an Iranian and in that also my work was not about diaspora at all. I think the cultural imagination of an Iranian in diaspora is like an explosion of all of those and a very kind of a and experiencing many of those like the Western gaze in a very different way. So I think my colleagues' works address that very much. But I think my own experience was that, as I said before my presentation, I kind of consider myself have not entered Canada yet after 3 years. So I have my own Iranian life, and I'm always imagining myself in Iran. And so I'm planning to go back. All my plans none of them are about staying here. All of them are going there. I'm like 8 hours a day on Facebook discussing about Iranian issues. So, and my work is also always connected to what I'm like seeing every day on Facebook. So yeah, I think this is my experience. So I think you could see it a little bit in my work too. For me, Iranian identity, my favorite Iranian identity is a non-identity. It's a moral collectivity of okay, what we all can do together. And that's why I brought Shariati on, because Shariati was who I think referring to local culture, but without ethnicizing the local culture in any sense. He was posing moral questions. So it was not identity, but moral collectivity, but I can call it right now. Yeah. So sorry for talking too much.
Thank you so much. That was a very important question, and I really like the phrase you used, common space. So, like, I can speak from my own perspective from the presentation that I did, that I also saw that complexity, like speaking about, specifically about hijab, and like having traveled, having immigrated from Iran, and that space, I think that distance is very important when it comes looking at your own identity. Distance plays a very important role, because what you can see, how you can define yourself is something else when you are in your, for example, in your own country or ethnic community, and how, what does it mean when you get distance from it? And I think it's a continuous kind of negotiation, and it's very difficult to come to one common space that I think if there is a common space, it's comprised of so many different perspectives, and it's comprised of so many different experiences that may come together. So this messiness, I think, might be the common space, because it's very difficult to come to just one answer. What is the Iranian identity? As our friends just commented, there are so many different ethnicities inside Iran, and even they experience being marginalized within that space. Then you can imagine how they would, how they could feel when they come out of Iran. So I just wanted to mention that for me, it's all about negotiation, and it's all about fluidity of identity and messiness. Mm-hmm. Any other responses or questions? Yes, please. Yes, you're good.
Thank you all. I'm very interested in a theme, I suppose, that was running through, and there's something sort of very. So on the one hand, I think a few times I heard it's sort of almost like this theory that a particular Western or European imaginary of ancient Middle East was itself imposed. Like, that's very interesting to me. I never quite thought about that very well. So I tried to think very concretely, like, what would one of those stories sound like that would be this way? So here's one I thought of. It was arguably 8th century BCE. We have the poems of Homer and Hesiod, and largely these shape the imaginary of the West with relationships to war, but also that's in the Iliad. But in the Odyssey, we find nostalgia, right, which is the longing for home. And so this constant journey trying to get home. What is home? Ithaca. What is home? Penelope. What is home? But we see this sort of this poetic myth of this longing for home. Now, whenever which is foundational for Hellenistic culture, in particular for the Greeks, and of course one of those Greeks, a Macedonian who studies in Athens, Aristotle, is completely transfigured by these poems, in particular by the epic poetry of Homer. Now it turns out that Aristotle becomes the tutor because he's a Macedonian, and because his father is working in the Persian court of Alexander. And so Alexander is educated by a paidagogos, a Greek teacher, Macedonian, again, Greek Macedonian, okay, this is itself a political issue. It teaches them the story of nostalgia, right, of the Odyssey, and also war, the Iliad. And so here we find ourselves, at this point, talking for hours about nostalgia, right, which is ultimately longing for home, belonging, and stuff like that. What I wonder is there a distinction to be made here between the sociological and historical and descriptive case that this happens to be a particular patrimony? It's definitely a male mythology that that has happened to endure, and that seems to very easily and symmetrically lay itself on the conversation, on the one hand. But on the other hand, that there's something very real about this sense of nostalgia. Like, I've thought a lot I think there's something very real about it. When I read the Odyssey, as a Mexican, not from Mexico, but also not from America, I read and I said, wow, that's so cool. Homer has a natural home to go to. I don't have nostalgia in the Greek sense. I have nostalgia for nostalgia. I have a longing for the longing of Odysseus' longing, right? And so I've written a little bit about nostalgia for nostalgia in the Latin American context, right? And I've had people push back, because Nassim, I sent you an email already asking for the citation. I've had people push back and say, oh, Sam, you're taking the Greeks and through Europeans and you're overlaying this on Latin America, and so you're just a coconut, you're brown on the outside but white on the inside, or Greek on the inside, or whatever. But I've always resisted that narrative because I said, no, but there was something, because you don't understand myth or poetics, but that there's something true about the longing for home, and there's something absolute and universal and eternal about our desire for desire, if we want to go in that direction. And so I wonder if like we've talked in a very sociological way today, but whether any of you have any of these senses of longings that might endure beyond the borders, as it were, of the sociological, and if you believe in them, or if you think about them, or if they affect you in any kind of way. I mean, Handel's looking at me like a heretic, but I went to church today, so sorry.
I'm not exactly sure what your question is because you gave a long explanation. But, yes, longing is one of human emotions, okay? And I think everybody experiences longing for something, yeah? And that thing might not be real, never existed or never experienced, yeah? So you can long for a place that you've never been to, okay? Or some kind of origin that you, basically based on your beliefs, you imagine that, yeah? So, for example, our national poet Rumi, is many of his poetry or some of the Sufi poetry is about longing to be united with God or some, a spiritual source of being, yeah? And this is, based on some belief that such source exists, yeah? And I want to address your question in another sense too. The situation is very complicated with people whose ancestors came from another place, but they are Canadians, yeah. And for example, their ancestors are from Persia or Mexico or this place and that place, and they've never been in those countries, and they have no memory of the places, and they cannot even speak that language. Okay, yeah, I met people like that, but they are actively longing to go back to Iran, yeah? Maybe if they go there, they will, so overwhelmed, yeah. So, yeah, I think that kind of longing or other kind of is a human emotion, yeah, that can exist. But also, you need to put things in political context. And you talked about Aristotle, and Alexander and that kind of things. That gives us a kind of political context, yeah? And sometimes people talk out of their experiences, which are political. For example, I give you an example from some Latin American writer, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, yeah? He lived in exile in Mexico, yeah? And but he wrote about Colombia, yeah, because I guess he won the Nobel Prize. Nobody, questioning his authenticity, coming, and saying, because you are promoting Western discourse and you have no right, there are, many Colombians write about your experiences. No, you can write about your experiences. And maybe because Colombia is not considered East or the Middle East, yeah. But, like myself as an Iranian who has lots of experiences, I wasn't dropped from the air in Canada, I lived for 27 years in Iran, yeah. And I experienced things in my own life with women's situation, yeah. But first of all, yeah, like I was forced at the age of 9 to wear compulsory hijab. I don't want to, so I can talk out of that experience. It has nothing to do with Western discourse. I had a child. The custody of my child wasn't given to me. My daughter was taken from me because of the law in that country. I can write about that, and I've written about that, yeah? So it has nothing to do with, promoting Western discourse. This dichotomy is dangerous, just limiting the freedom of expression of people like myself to say that, no, you have no right to talk out of your experiences, Talk about, the women's issue in Iran, which I experience with, my blood, my skin, my bones, Like, it's not easy to be separated from your child, or many things that I went through. So I want to say that things are political, and we have a right to talk about, a country. If we are coming from that country and we have enough experience, living here doesn't disqualify us from talking about that. And we cannot be accused that we are promoting some Western, because these experiences are real, like the experiences that that woman and another guy talked about. These are real experiences, yeah.
My claim is that there is some needed dose, maybe even a drop of universality, though, in order to make these claims about the ability for one to speak from one's own experience. And so to me, it's a both and, but I think the drop of universality, which I think you shared there really effectively, is kind of, in some sense, what I was asking about, what I was looking for.
I'm sure it's a very vibrant and interesting topic for discussion, but I know we are out of time, and some of our panelists are they're parking, so this is expired. So let's just keep the vibrant. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. These are very interesting times we're living in. And some people have said some very radical things about what needs to be done in these times. These are very dangerous times in which identity and identities of certain people, especially the problem of Islamophobia, have really come to the fore. And when I think about what I try to put together here is what I think is a quiet way of making another kind of statement. Can we talk about the complexities of identity and belonging in more than one space, as the presenters have done? And I want to thank all of them for doing it. And can we also see this as another way of maybe resisting in these times? So I want to invite you to join me in thanking the panelists and in thanking the discussant as well. And I want to thank you for being here. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.